Welcome back to Natural Ones, everyone. Today I'm going to be trying out a bit of a new series in which I select a classic monster across D&D and take a look at them through each edition that they appear in. Then I'll rank their art and design, lore, and abilities and combat skill out of 10, tally up the score, and find the winning edition for the best representation of that monster. I'm thinking about calling it Monster Melee or Edition Encounter, so let me know what you think in the comments. Today I've selected an iconic D&D monster, the Lich. Liches are the remains of great wizards who embrace undeath as a means of preserving themselves. No matter what edition you choose, these are going to be deadly and higher level monsters for their time. I'm just going to be going over the lore and the art and all of that for their respective monster manuals, so I'm not going to dive into any other source books for these monsters. With all that out of the way, let's get right on to the first edition. The Lich in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons appears in the monster manual. And right away, we establish that it passes from a state of humanity to a non-human, non-living existence through force of will. We don't outright say undead in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but it's pretty much the same concept throughout. It describes their layers a little bit, but doesn't really go into the process of how one becomes a Lich. It just says that you have to be a very powerful magic user. So right away, the lore is not extensive for these, and it is kind of up in the air for you to determine where it comes from or how to put one into your game, but a really good start. And I'm going to give the lore a 5 out of 10. There's not much here to work with, but this is a really core foundational idea of the Lich, and it's a really cool monster regardless. Now, moving on to the art. I mean, I really like the art for the first edition. I don't know why. And even though it's not a full body, it just encapsulates so much of what I think the Lich looks like. It's not just some generic undead. Right away, it gives him a crown and some look of almost regalness or refinement that I believe a Lich has that separates them from the rest of the undead hordes that you encounter. It has great emotion in the face, great hand movements. I really like this. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I really like the first edition art in general, so I might be a little biased. It is black and white, but I just think it has so much character and it really conveys a Lich well. Moving on to combat, we're not going to compare CR to CR, AC to AC, or attacks, because different editions, different numbers means different things. So we're just going to look at some of the core abilities. Now, they're all going to be powerful across these editions, so we don't really need to compare power level that much. They give them a cold touch that can also paralyze their opponents. They give them this kind of frightening aura, which if anyone sees them, they have a chance to be frightened and run away. And finally, like all Liches we're going to see today, they have a suite of magical abilities. It doesn't describe what magic, it just says the appropriate level of what they achieved before they became a Lich, which could be 18th level or above. So not much in the way of the combat for this one. I'm actually going to give it a 3 out of 10. It doesn't really inspire me that much. You kind of just have to make a wizard and then flavor him undead. Has a couple cool abilities, but in the end, it's kind of lame with that. So all in all, that brings the total up for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first edition to a 16. Decent score, kind of carried by the art, but overall a great start. Alright, getting into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition, we'll get right into some of this lore, which they improve greatly upon from the first one. First off, it right away says that they're probably the most powerful form of undead known to exist. It also gets into the phylactery, which is a core foundation of the Lich. It says it's similar to Magic's spell jar, and to ensure the final destruction of a Lich, its body must be wholly annihilated, and its phylactery must be sought out and destroyed in some manner. So one of the capstone abilities of the lore kind of side of the Lich, not like the in-combat mechanical side, that is one of the hallmarks of the Lich, at least now. It describes where it would live in its society, how they're solitary, how they would have a lair, an ominous fortified area like a vast subterranean crypt. It also gives it some powers as a necromancer, saying that it can animate an army of undead. There's even a lot more about how they live and how they act, but I won't get into it now, but they really detail it well. And the last thing I'll talk about is they actually kind of detail the process to create a phylactery. Is it must prepare its phylactery by the use of the enchanted item, magic jar, permanency, and reincarnation spells. It has to be an object of 1,500 gold pieces per level of the wizard, and then it must be enchanted with more spells even. The wizard drinks it, and then they undergo a transformation, which may actually end up killing the wizard, and if they do eventually succeed, they become a Lich. Great lore for this, completely blowing the first edition out of the water, actually getting into how one's created, where they live, how they fight. It's just really cool in my opinion, and they did a great job with this. So I'm going to give the lore an 8 out of 10 on this one. Now, getting into the art, I was a little disappointed because it does not really match the description that well. And they say it should resemble a wight or a mummy, gaunt and skeletal. It even describes their eye sockets as black and empty, save for the fierce pinpoints of light which serve the Lich as eyes. I guess it does kind of just remind me of a wight or a mummy. It doesn't really look regal, I mean, I know it's garbed in fine clothes, but this could just be a wight or a mummy that was revived from some noble's crypt. It doesn't really give me the look of this refinement of a wizard and this powerful look or powerful attributes in any way, like the crown in the previous one. Even though I don't think it's bad art at all, I think it's a cool photo. I just don't think it speaks to me as the Lich, so I'm gonna give it a 4 out of 10. And the abilities are pretty much the same. It still has this aura that frightens, and it also has this touch that freezes and also paralyzes. It does add the phylactery, which I will kind of add to the combat side because it makes it extremely difficult to kill them. And adds a stipulation that it makes it harder to hit them. You have to have a +1 weapon or by monsters with 6 or more hit dice. Again, we won't get into the numbers too much, but they do add some condition that makes it a bit harder to hit them. So I'm just going to upgrade this a little bit from the previous edition to a 4. I would still like to see the actual spells or give some inspiration for that, or more abilities, because the abilities it gives are really just touch ones, and I know that they're extremely powerful and you can make this magic whatever you want, but I'm talking about strictly what's in the monster manual here. So you can really make a cool witch with all of the spells provided to you, but that's not really what I'm reviewing. Now, if you're counting at home, you know that brings our total up to a 16, tying first edition. So hopefully we have another one break ahead or we'll have a tie. Now, on to third edition, and they went and made it a little complicated. And that could be good or bad in my opinion. They basically didn't make a monster. There's not a Lich that you can plop down into your games. The Lich in this one is more of a template that you can apply to a wizard or a sorcerer, or even clerics and other spellcasters. So they give an example of an 11th level wizard that I'll be going over. But again, you're just going to be using the stats of whatever thing turned into the Lich, and it's not really the monster itself. Now in this one, for the phylactery, you have to have a feat that will be able to do it, the craft wondrous item feat, and it costs a lot of gold and XP, interestingly enough. But we won't get into too much of how to create it, but they do have a pretty detailed process of how one can create a phylactery. Now the only reason I really like this is because the other ones are saying like the DM can create a Lich based off of a wizard or a sorcerer, and it really just gives the DM more work instead of being able to adapt a monster already there. But this one to me is kind of saying a player or a similar character that you have built can turn into a Lich, getting all of these abilities on top. Now you might not see a huge difference between the two, but I actually think this is much cooler. It lays out a template for how you can apply this to anything, and it actually gives mechanics and rules about how to do it. I actually think this is an upgrade in lore, even though they don't get too much about how they act or a lot of stuff that second edition did right, and I'm gonna give it a 7. I think the fact that any spellcaster can be a Lich, including players, really adds a cool element to the game of just being able to say this isn't just some monster, it could be anyone. Now, onto the art for this one. We're finally getting back to more of a crown. It is depicted with a sword and tattered kind of royal garbs again. So it really kind of does look again just like a regular generic undead, but certain aspects of it, the face and the emotion, and then the crown itself, along with some of the chains and some of the garb that it has on, really says Lich to me more. I could definitely look at this and tell you it's a Lich, unlike second edition. That being said, I actually still don't like it as much as first, so I'm going to give it a 7 for this edition. Onto the combat side, we see the same abilities that we've seen in the last two, the paralyzing touch and then the aura of fear. And it might just be third edition, but it looks like this one tacks on quite a bit of resistances and immunities that the other ones didn't have. It also ups its intelligence, wisdom, and charisma all by +2. And then it also gives +8 to a lot of the skills it had, and this is all on top of your base level stats before you became the Lich. I think this is by a small margin the best one we've seen yet. Again, it uses the spells, it has the same 2 abilities, but some of these stats raising and the fact that it stacks on top of things that you already have, making whatever character turns into this Lich a lot better. I mean, +6 ability score is pretty good. I would say that this one is probably better than the other ones, and I'm going to give it a 5 for combat and abilities, propelling this one into first place with a whopping score of 19. Moving on to 4th edition, we are very similar to 3rd edition. Again, it is just a template on top of a character that you already have that you apply this lichdom to. But this one already has a distinct difference. It highlights a couple different of liches you can be: a human lich, an eladrin lich, and a lich vestige. And I think that there are more of these in the Dungeon Master's Guide because the entire process and template is laid out there. But the interesting thing I thought was it immediately gives kind of flavor text individual to the different types of liches, giving them different combat tactics and how they would generally act and how often they would get into combat or stay back. And then again, it gets into the phylactery and a little bit of the transformation. It does detail its own transformation process in a small bit of text, as well as it actually gives different knowledge checks like 4th edition does, and it highlights what a character would know depending on the DC. And it does actually give some interesting flavor text to this, and it details that even if you kill a lich in its phylactery, there's a chance it can come back. Creatures like Orcus and Vecna could revive a lich. Also, if you roll the highest DC check, it also gives you some history about some famous liches, which again, Vecna and Acererak. It also adds a little bit of background to Orcus, and apparently all the liches get their powers from Orcus, and they pay homage to Orcus, and at any moment he can destroy their phylactery and them. So I really like this lore. I like the different variants, and I like the actual kind of name drops and lore tie-ins to the rest of the world. So I'm going to give this one an 8. Getting on to the art and design, I think it is probably my favorite one so far. It combines everything that I've kind of liked about the Lich design so far. It's kind of these royal garbs, a bit tattered, but also held enough together to give it some sort of dignity and composure. A skull with red glowing eyes, and also kind of this crown that almost looks embedded in part of the head. This all goes down to them holding a spell or in the middle of casting a spell with a really good menacing look on their face. I think that this one encapsulates everything that I've been saying, and this is definitely a Lich. You know it the second you look at it, and you can kind of tell its intentions. You can tell it's in the middle of some encounter. It's just really good design in my opinion, and I'm going to give this art an 8. Like I said, the detailed template for creating these is in the DMG, so I can't get to what the actual possible list of abilities is. It looks like you kind of pick, because on the human and eladrin, there are different abilities, so I'm just going to go over all the ones that I see here. They have a ranged shadow ray. They have an area of effect called frostburn. They also have a second wind ability, which heals them in combat on the human variant. Looking at the Ladrin, they have a ranged attack called Shadow Ray, which does necrotic, a necrotic orb, which is ranged and also stuns the opponent, and an entropic burst, which is another area of effect. And finally, on the Lich Vestige, I see Aura of Annihilation, I see Orb of Obliteration, and Death's Touch. So a lot of abilities to mix and match from if you're creating a Lich, but I would say it's a little bit of a confusing process. Like, this doesn't seem like it's just stopping at the fact that it's just a monster anymore. Like, this is a template, and this is almost like a clash. You're picking different abilities, and this human Lich gets these 3 abilities, and this Eladrin Lich gets these abilities. So I'm not going to count them all against it. I do like the fact that it can pick and choose what it seems like, but actually the abilities themselves are just ranged attacks or area of effects. There's not that much groundbreaking here. And also, unless I'm losing something, they do have frost abilities, but it looks like they lose their frighten area of effect and also this paralyzing touch that was common among all 3 previous editions of Liches. These abilities might be buried in the DMG, but again, I just said I'd look at the monster manual version of this, and it seems kind of difficult to just plop a Lich down into your game. So I do like the combat, but overall, I'm going to give it a 5. I think this could have been higher, but the complexity and the fact that they got rid of some of the abilities kind of dropped it down. And 4th edition wraps up with a score of 21, again taking the lead over the previous 3. And finally, on to the 5th edition Lich. Getting into the lore, it seems like most things are the same, but we do get a little more background and flavor on it. This is the first thing that kind of doesn't just flat out say this is how you create a phylactery, which I think is a positive thing. I would like the rules for it in there somewhere, so maybe this is just lazy design, but it kind of speaks to the fact that it is a closely guarded secret, and it's not just floating around in the world. It details the process, and it really kind of matches the phylactery, creating the poison, the wizard could die, but again, it doesn't list exact figures or exact spells that they need to cast. It also adds something called soul sacrifices, in which the Lich periodically needs to feed off of souls. It does this to preserve itself and preserve its phylactery. It even details how it would do this with the imprisonment spell. I think this is a worthwhile add and gives a lot of cool flavor and lore to the Lich and how they stay at that power level that they're maintaining. Also details what they're up to and why they might be involved in your story, and also gives a good reason that they might be isolated or singly focused on their own task for why they might have been dormant or not active in a certain campaign or setting. It of course details their lair and some of their lair actions as well, but overall I think that this lore is a culmination of what we've seen. It doesn't get rid of anything except for maybe a little bit of the process, but to me this feels more like a boss. It was created as a higher level boss for your games, and it attaches the right lore and flavor around the text that is appropriate with that, and could be a big bad evil guy in your game as well. So I'm going to tie this lore for the #1 spot again and give it an 8. Getting into the art and design, I think the art is good. It's really well done at the very least. It doesn't scream Lich. I don't like how they got rid of the crown that they have in some of the editions. Clearly you can tell I'm biased by it, but I think it's kind of an iconic part of the Lich, this kind of crown built in their head, even though they're not like a king necessarily, as their appropriate outfit and garbs. It kind of doesn't have too much emotion in my opinion. Kind of just an undead look on its face. Again, it could be misconstrued as just an ornately dressed undead. So it's not inspiring too much to me. There's no sense of magic or mysticism in it, so I'm gonna give this one a 5. I think it looks good, but it doesn't really say Lich to me. Then getting onto some of the abilities, and also I'm going to exclude layer actions in this as they're kind of an add-on in the 5th edition, so I'm not going to get into all of that. Paralyzing touch, and we're back to our roots. We get cold damage and a chance to paralyze the target. They kind of nerfed the frightening gaze from what it used to be now. Now you focus on one creature and give it a chance to be frightened. And finally we have disrupt life, where each living creature within 20 feet of the Lich must make a DC 18 Constitution saving throw. It's pretty good damage, and you can do this once around for legendary actions. Then finally we get on to the spell casting. It's a level 18th spellcaster, and I'll just show them briefly, but it has a lot of spells including Power Word Kill, Dominate Monster, and Power Word Stun. Now a lot of the other monsters could also include these, so this might be a wash. I do like the fact that it gives you something. You can plop this in your game. I know I can change the spells if I want to as a DM to other wizard spells or sorcerer spells, whatever I want, but the fact that you can just take this monster and put it into a game and that's your Lich, I kind of like, and that's also an element of 5e that I really like in general. But overall, I think this is my favorite ability. It combines a lot of the ones from the other ones, the fact that you can drop it into a game, and the fact that it has these spell lists and the additional disrupt life ability. I'm going to give it a 6. Which actually only brings the total up to a 19. So that means that somehow 4th edition is the winner of the first monster melee or encounters of the editions. Somehow this one. Usually I think 4th edition is everyone's least favorite. I do think, with a caveat on this winner, a little asterisk, that it is a little confusing and there's different templates and it's not really just one monster, which makes it kind of hard to compare some of these one-to-one. But overall, you have to give the art props. I think it was the best art, and a lot of the lore of the history of the Liches that were associated in just this small block and their behavior. You have to give it credit, and some of the mechanics might be wonky, but I think that the Lich from 4th edition is the best representation of a Lich that we've had so far. So everyone, let me know what you think in the comments. What was your favorite art? What was your favorite version of the Lich from each of these editions? Is there anything I missed? Let me know in the comments, and please do not forget to like and subscribe. Let me know if you like this kind of show. I thought this would be a fun idea to kind of take a look at the monster through the ages and do a fun process of comparing the art and the abilities and some of the lore. And thanks for watching, everyone. I appreciate it. That's it for me.